Hello and welcome to the Richmond Center for Visual Arts here on the campus of Western Michigan University. My name is Indra Latsis and I am Director of Exhibitions at the Richmond Center. And I am so pleased today to help introduce 5 faculty and staff from the Frostic School of Art here in the College of Fine Arts, who will share with you about their work on view recently as part of our annual faculty and staff exhibition.
Hi, I'm Patricia Villalobos Echeverría, and I'm a professor of art here at the Gwen Frostic School of Art. And we're going to talk a little bit about the works that I have here in the faculty exhibition. And these are a series of lithographs. They are 4-color lithographs, and they were generated from photographs that I took in Managua, Nicaragua, which is where I'm from. The photographs the original photographs were actually taken during an insurrection and protests that were going on in the country against the government. And this happened in 2018, May and April of that year. And the image is deliberately blurred for the majority of the image, with only a sliver of documentation of the actual original image that's visible to the viewer. And that is on purpose to try and comment and have a discussion about the difficulty of being able to hear and sense and understand the situation. Often I feel that media tends to barrage us with information that we tend to have a loss of sensibility to what's going on around the world, and certainly also in our local area. So the works are done in lithography also because I wanted to kind of think back to the function of the lithograph as a medium for subversive information, the dissemination of information, the idea of it being the original way that we could get news through newspapers. So there's a deliberateness about thinking about the history of the medium and why I was using it. And this is part of a larger series of works that work in photography, in video, and also in prints, as you see here. These works reference protests that were going on in Nicaragua, but very similarly are eerily similar to some of the images that I saw here in Kalamazoo during the Black Lives Matter protests. And there's a series, so the work will continue, the series continues into other lithographs and videos that will be based on images that I took here in Kalamazoo. The idea of the works being in a series also speaks about that moment of capturing the photograph and then just getting that particular view. And they are consecutive, that is, they were taken, there were hundreds of images that were taken consecutively, so that you only see one sliver. It is never the same image that you're seeing, so each of the photographs are different at different sites during the protests of that time. And so the idea is that you get only a little sliver in each of the prints.
Hi, I'm Ryan Lewis. I'm a graphic designer, animator, and artist, and I teach graphic design here in the Frostic School of Art. Symbols are born with intended messages or ideals, but their most enduring associations accumulate over time. Symbols are not content, but are instead vessels in which content is stored. As the celebrated American corporate logo designer Paul Rand once stated, it is only by association that a logo, or a symbol, takes on any real meaning. It derives its meaning and usefulness from the quality of that which it symbolizes. Where symbols are concerned, meanings come and go. They amass in rich, messy, complicated, diverse, beautiful layers. Accumulated meanings can sometimes be contradictory and problematic. I see this piece as a sort of personal art therapy piece. It's a huge departure in subject matter from my past work. It's sort of a kinetic digital painting that expresses the thoughts, concerns, stresses, anxieties, internal conflicts, cognitive dissonance, everything swirling around in my head that has kept me and keeps me awake at night. a way to put some of the concerning events of the past few years down and work through them. As this is the first time I've shown this piece, I'm still making sense of what the work means for me and whether I should have followed the impulse to make it to begin with. But from an artistic standpoint, and in terms of process, the piece provided some exciting challenges for me. This is the first time I've collaborated on a stop motion animation with live organisms, the waxworms that you see in the animation. Also, this is my first time doing stop motion animation with raw meat, though I have used food in other pieces, and it does seem to be a recurring fascination that comes up in my work. This piece has also allowed me to further explore alternative digital animation techniques and ways of combining manual and digital animation into the same work, a vein of exploration that I'm continuing from a previous animation titled Inverted Sanctuary 6, in which I animated a book and its text content. This piece involved Photoshop, batch processing, and the creation of fonts. I selected many of these materials for their complex associations and potential as symbols. This piece started with my own personal observation on how our national flag, something that has generally in the past had positive associations for me, has accumulated a lot of negative associations, particularly as a result of January 6th. As I walk around my neighborhood and see houses flying the flag, even on non-holidays, now I can't help but feel a bit of suspicion as to their motives. Is there extremism at play? Of course, this probably isn't always the case. Many of them are probably just deeply concerned about our current instability. But this reaction re-emphasized for me how far public discourse has digressed to this really concerning place that an iconic national symbol would produce a sickening or nauseous feeling for me. I see this work as a way of questioning the simplistic view that America always equals good, right, no matter what, and that its favorable status is fixed, when in reality there is a lot of complexity at play. America is struggling to live up to its ideals, as it always has, and aspects of our system are clearly in need of a redesign. But when there are a diversity of views, opinions, and backgrounds included and listened to, though this is not a harmonious process, and though it's without question always going to be a work in progress, there is a certain beauty to the striving for a shared vision and a respect for differences. The differences mix into something that is dynamic, rich, and alive, despite the lack of clarity. These fibers form a fragile, loosely connected fabric that precariously hovers between states of order and chaos. This delicate vision is contrasted with hard-edged, high-contrast digital materials. Despite the diverse ways of seeing the world, we are stuck with a very limited political menu where it feels like there are only two options. You're either this or you're that, where a category matters more than individual characteristics and actions. And this binary is unfortunately present everywhere we look, especially in digital spaces, but it doesn't accurately represent the diversity of the general population or the degree of nuance that really exists. The conflict between extremes, the tribalism, overshadows our shared visions of who we are. There are moments in the piece where a more clearly defined symbol emerges, and despite its certainty and familiarity, there is also an ick factor to it. A realization that choosing to see ourselves with this kind of forced clarity is in fact dangerous, toxic, and not as great as we expected it would be. As writer Frank Bruni recently reflected in the New York Times, I sense that many Americans, overwhelmed by the volume of competing information that comes at them and the furious pace of its delivery, outsource their judgment to a tribe and its leaders. Those leaders give them certainty in place of ambiguity, definitive answers in lieu of smarter questions. They're liberated from genuine inquiry and freed from doubt. The digital tools we've been given to express ourselves and the invisible structures and constraints of these platforms unfortunately also influence the nature of the discourse. Another material I used was found social media messages. I converted this very raw data into animated red and blue forms. To do this, I designed custom font files. You may be familiar with dingbats fonts, such as Zapf dingbats or webdings, which are actually libraries of different symbols and pictograms rather than letters and numbers. I designed my own systems of symbols, some found, some new, to replace the letters of the alphabet in the posts, so that the messages are translated into fields of texture. This technique recalls what postmodernist graphic designer David Carson famously did back in the 90s as the art director of Ray Gun magazine. Carson set an entire article in the font Zapf Dingbats because he didn't consider the content of the article worth reading. Each social media message in my piece becomes an illegible moment in the visual cacophony of the whole. In the end, the din overshadows shared ideals in a slow march toward estrangement. This piece deconstructs and reconstructs an old symbol using new symbols. It challenges tribalism and questions the status quo of our binary political power structures. It invites reconsideration of a familiar symbol often thought of as static and fixed. Symbols can be tarnished by misuse, replacing associations of pride with embarrassment, shame, and fear. It reminds us that symbols are what we make them. They can represent our successes and ideals, but also our collective failures, insensitivities, overconfidence, and divisions. Thanks for letting me share a little bit more about my work. It's been helpful to articulate some of these thoughts.
My name is Tanya Bakija. I'm the coordinator of exhibitions at the Richmond Center for Visual Arts at Western Michigan University. I have 3 pieces in this exhibition, the annual faculty and staff exhibition, and they are from a series entitled Enduring Domesticity. These works explore the mundane chores that are often referred to as women's work, which are usually washing dishes and doing laundry. Because these chores are often referred to as women's work, I used a technique that is often referred to as feminine, domestic, and utilitarian, which is sewing. So these are sewn drawings illustrating this work. Traditionally in fine art, there's been a dichotomy between low art and high art. And traditionally, high art is the type of work that you would see in a museum. So large oil paintings, marble sculptures, charcoal drawings, things of that nature were always referred to as high art. And low art would be the more utilitarian types of work, such as graphic design, pottery, ceramics, and quilting and sewing, and the fiber arts. However, these low arts are finally getting some recognition in the fine art world, which they definitely deserve. I've always been drawn to the low art type of work of graphic design, comics, and cartoons. And so utilizing craft to create these types of work was a very natural vehicle for me. There's a simplified approach that this work has, using contour lines and flat graphic areas of color, which helps simplify the narrative, which is the story that is in the artwork, so that the emphasis and the attention is drawn to the story rather than to how the artwork is made. This approach also helps me to allow the viewer to get into the work and to engage with the work, but at the same time, it's not asking too much of them. So you don't have to know my personal history in order to understand this type of work. When I started art school, I was introduced to certain fine artists that appealed to me with their low art techniques of contour lines and flat graphic areas. One artist is Ida Appelbrug, and her earlier works from the 1990s really appealed to me. The way she describes a story in these images is very much like a comic or a graphic novel. Later in my career, I had the opportunity to exhibit the work of Kathy Halper, who also does fine art embroidery, sewn drawings of her work. Kathy Halper's work takes images from Facebook and other social media images and embroiders them into beautiful contour line drawings. The sewing machine is a great way to create a contour line drawing, and it really is the optimal vehicle for my type of work. This is a piece that is related to the work, but it's not in the exhibition. But as you can see, it's made on a very thin, crinkly fabric. And I chose this thin, crinkly fabric to help draw people in to the piece, because from far away, you can't really tell that that it is a sewn drawing. But the crinkles help bring people in, and then they see that it is a sewn drawing. And on the back, sometimes people like to see that, but you know, sometimes you have the messiness of the sewing machine. But I use what I describe as an analog sewing machine. It is a Singer 4830C 32 stitch machine that I have just discovered is referred to now as vintage. But it does not have a computer in it. So all of these stitches I created by moving the needle and thread myself with the machine. The unfinished edges of this piece also refer to the unfinished nature of this type of work. I'm sure we all have experienced that moment when we empty the sink of dishes and then a loved one comes in with a dirty spoon or a dirty plate, and it's never ending. And these chores, these never ending chores, take new meaning for me, especially the unraveled edges, because I am a working mother of a special needs child, and these chores are now more consequential than they were when I made this work, which is when I was in grad school and living by myself and, you know, didn't have to worry about mountains of laundry. You just do what you do when you're in grad school. To make these drawings, I start with a drawing on embroidery stitch and tear material. And it's a material that doesn't really have a grain to it, so you can tear it away from any direction. But this was very loose and kind of hard to control under the sewing machine. So after a while, I added a thicker interfacing to the back of them. Specifically, I used a Pellon ultra firm one-sided fusible interfacing. So the fusible means that with my iron I can permanently attach the crinkle fabric to it, and then I had a more durable substrate to work off of, and that gave me better results with my more intricate sewing projects. The threads I use are Gutermann threads. They're very high quality threads, and I found that they worked very well with this application and with these techniques. And they have a lot of variety of color, but I tend to stick with plain black threads on white fabric as a nod to my love of comics and graphic novels. These pieces are painted in using golden fluid acrylics, and while they work well here, I found that I don't really like working with them. However, there was a lovely surprise when installing this work. This work has never been shown in an exhibition before, and some of the thinner pieces that don't have that thicker substrate on the back produced lovely shadows, and that was a really nice surprise when seeing this work displayed in the gallery. I wanted to share my journey about my non-traditional path to the art world. It was very important for me to share this information with everyone because I learned that through hard work, we can end up being in a field that maybe wasn't where we planned, but is actually where we absolutely need to be. When I was younger, all my free time was spent studying foreign languages, music, and academics. My parents came to this country in the early 1970s, so I'm first generation American, and we spoke German in the home. So starting in third grade, I was enrolled into German school and was enrolled in German school from third grade to 12th grade. In school, I played clarinet and tenor saxophone, and outside of school, I took piano classes. I was geared up for a career in music and also math and foreign languages. I was on the math team in high school. I also was the captain of my girls' bowling team in high school for 2 years. So I had no time to take any art classes. My sister, my older sister, was always the artist. She went to college for photography and visual communications, and as I was finishing up high school, she was in grad school going for another visual arts degree. So I was not the artist in the family, my sister was. However, my grades were so good my senior year of high school that I was finally able to take another elective class. So I finally was able to take my first art class. So it was 1997, and I took digital art, and it was the first kind of digital art class that was offered in our school district. So I immersed myself into the world of Photoshop 4.0 and just devoured everything I could. I spent so much time and impressed my teachers so much that they gave me access to the good computer in the little closet, and I was able to take the same class as an independent study the following semester. And it really helped me realize that one does not need to be born with an innate talent to draw or paint or sculpt, but like everything else, it is something that can be taught. And not only, you have to also practice it too to get better at it. And that was kind of a revelation to me. I really never saw myself as an artist because I didn't feel like I could draw, but I found the right teacher and made that connection and just fell in love with it. When I went to college, I still was in my foreign language and music track. I was a double major in math and music with a minor in German at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. And it didn't really work out for me. I had to take a medical leave of absence from the school in early 2000. And for a story better saved for another time, I found myself in Michigan later that year and got a full-time job and was just making my way through life, not really knowing what I was doing. In February of 2001, however, a few months after moving to Michigan, my mother was diagnosed with cancer and 4 months later passed away. And the death was very traumatic for me. I wasn't able to have proper closure because I never got to see her body after she passed. So I was in a spiral of grief, and like many mothers, she was the nucleus of our small family, and I just suddenly felt like my life had to be refocused and repurposed, and through the grief and through the tragedy, I found a renewed purpose to finish my education and to live a life that sought balance and emphasized seeking joy, because life is short and precious, and each day we wake up is a gift. So in 2003, I enrolled at Michigan State University as a transfer student into the art program, and in 2006, I graduated with my BFA in studio art. And through the work that I made in my undergrad time was very focused on trauma and grief. And I realized that once I went to grad school that I still wanted to play with the narrative, which I'm doing here with this work, but I also realized that I didn't want it to be so personal that people could not engage with the work. So like I said earlier, you don't need to have to know me or my history to kind of understand a little bit about where this work is coming from. One thing that I really credit my mother for helping me with is that almost every weekend when I was growing up, we would go to the museums in Chicago, and almost every Saturday we were at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I remember vividly one day where there was this special programming, and I created a paper kite at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I have no doubt that subconsciously those trips with my mother to the museums helped guide me to the path that I'm at now, which is where I have a career in museums. I am the coordinator of exhibitions here at the Richmond Center. So additionally, in my role here as a coordinator of exhibitions, I installed this exhibition. I helped lay it out and get all of the works up on the wall. And as we were preparing for this exhibition, I noticed that there was nothing like the type of work that I have here to share with students, because this exhibition really is for our students to show them what their teachers and what the staff in the Frostic School of Art do. So I was inspired to show students this type of work, to show them that there is other things out there to try and to explore and to experience. And I think that is one of the things that my journey has helped solidify, is that you have to step out of your comfort zone in order to try something new and make change happen. And sometimes that can lead to beautiful things.
Hi, my name is Karen Bondarchuk, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a series of works that I've been working on for the past several years called Bread and the Bone. And I have 3 examples of those in the exhibition here. And the series really started as a result of my explorations of bird art. So I've been examining birds and things related to crows and ravens primarily over the past 10 or 15 years or so. And I started to become interested in the evolution of species, looking at it not so much in a kind of purely biological sense, but more in a kind of philosophical, ethological, ecological way. So I started doing research on crows and ravens and their antecedents. And one of the dinosaurs that I discovered was the one that's actually depicted here, which is called Deinonychus. And it's a Cretaceous era dinosaur that was feathered, didn't fly, but has direct links to our present day birds. And so I'm fascinated by this idea of these birds that we see every day in our lives being these residual dinosaurs, these flying dinosaurs that we just, kind of take for granted. So I started doing research into not just bird evolution, but into other creatures, looking at the ways in which dinosaurs are unearthed. I actually went out to Wyoming and did a dig several years ago in the part of Wyoming that is primarily the Eocene era. And so as part of that dig, I was looking at and digging up, small mandibles of long extinct creatures that are about 55 million years old. And I just became fascinated by this idea of unearthing. And so one of the things that started to happen with this series was that I started to think about the material and the process of how we extract dinosaur bones, how we extract fossils. And one of the things about this work that is kind of different in terms of the world of drawing and painting is that I create my own gesso. And gesso is made up of limestone and collagen. So it's essentially a protein-based collagen, i.e. gelatin, which is extracted usually from bovine bones. And limestone, which is the carapaces and fossilized remains of sea creatures. And so I bring together pulverized limestone and gelatin, and that's actually what this surface is on these panels. And I create thin layers of this handmade gesso, sand it down in between layers, and what I get is this really marvelous surface on which I can lay inks, I can lay charcoal, I can inscribe into it. And that's where I started to get excited with this work, because each of the bony sections here is actually drawn by carving. So in some ways, I'm sort of excavating the images of the bony creatures, the fossils. I'm sort of extracting those out of the surface material. And so I love this idea of the surface and the process having meaning that links it to the work. So, the series itself is called Bread and the Bone, and that comes from a Robertson Davies novel, someone whom I'm very fond of, but the idea that really for me is important in this is coming from the philosophy of Fernando Pessoa, and he was famous for writing this book called The Book of Disquiet, and one of his quotes goes something like, "What we see is not what we see, but what we are." And for me, it connects with this idea of we are connected to everything on the planet. We're connected to each other, certainly, as human beings, as a species. We have, distant connections to the primates. We have even more distant connections to banana trees. If we go back far enough in time, we're connected to everything that's around us. And so for me, that kind of philosophical underpinning, that ecological underpinning, but the sort of ethology of it all, for me was really important in this series, thinking about the deeper connections that we have with other species, not just birds, but with other creatures. So the other works here that are in the exhibition relate to those similar ideas. This one here was created a couple of years ago, and it's called Shadow Relations. And it's about the biological connections between the chamois, which is a deer-like creature, an ungulate, with cetaceans, dolphins, porpoises, whales. And they are within, the same connected family in terms of the strong biological connections there. And so if you go back to the Eocene era, when cetaceans first sort of appeared on the planet, they were coming out of a time when they were terrestrial. So, our present day whales, porpoises, and dolphins, and those other sea creatures often have vestigial back limbs. So from the time when they left the water and came onto land, or vice versa, we have these strong connections that happen between these creatures. So a lot of my research has been in natural history museums, looking at those deeper connections between creatures. The last one here is one that I created in 2020, and it's called Manner of Speaking. And it was actually inspired by a trip to British Columbia, where my family comes from, and I visited a local museum there on Vancouver Island, and they had a sea otter skeleton. And the way that they had it displayed, it looked almost as though the sea otter was trying to say something by cupping its hands around its mouth. And so I started to think about this idea of bones speaking. I mean, we can look at them in terms of their DNA and what they contain as speaking or communicating, but also just literally this idea. So this was one of the more sort of whimsical pieces that came out of this series, in which it almost appears that the sea otter is sort of creating these thought bubbles on which this raven is sort of resting and trying to listen and understand. So a lot of this series, much as it has a kind of basis in biology and paleontology, it's equally for me one about poetry, it's about philosophy, and again, coming back to the idea of that interconnectedness that happens between us and everything else that's on the planet.
Hi, I've wanted to be an artist ever since I can remember. I'm the youngest of 4 kids, all girls, grew up in the country, and all 3 of my older sisters made art when I was young. And I suppose the defining moment when I really knew I wanted to be an artist was when I was about 4 years old. And I used to watch Romper Room with Miss Lois from KTVI in St. Louis. And at the end of her show, she would ask for drawings from kids, and she would look through her magic mirror and say, I see Bobby, I see Sally, I see Mary, and I thought she could see me. So when she would ask for particular drawings, I would make them, and then my sisters would help me mail them. You might think that's the end of the story, but what was really validating is that I would get these kind of manufactured postcards back from Miss Lois that had her picture on it, and on the back it would be a stamped text saying, oh, thank you so much, we appreciate you, with blanks for the kid's name and blank for the signature of Miss Lois, because the hostess could change. I still have those pictures, and they're actually framed and in my office. So it was my first real validation that art was worth doing and something could come to you from it. So the work I have in the faculty show is recent work from the last 3 years. And for some time I've been playing with patterns as a symbolic stand-in for emotions and experience, and sometimes people. This particular piece is one that I did prior to the pandemic. I was really playing a lot with patterns across the surface in a flat way that really suggested textiles. One thing you'll notice is I love pattern, and I also really love bright colors. So these works are heavily layered with really bright colors. They're painted in encaustic wax, which is beeswax mixed with pigment, and I use it in a molten state, which means that I have to work off of a hot palette with hot brushes, and my surface has to be warm. So everything's warm as I'm painting, and then because it's wax, it cools as soon as it leaves the heat, starts to cool. And one thing I love about painting with wax is that I can embed things in it, and I can build off of the surface. So in this particular piece, Tethered, one thing I've done is I've used 2 different patterns at this dividing line, and then I've incised pattern into both areas, and then I also work additively where I go back into the materials, into the painting with materials on the top. I've been working with encaustic probably for about 18 years and started working figuratively and really started working with pattern after a trip to Indonesia in 2009. I was working with batik artists as well as painters and teaching encaustic workshops to them, and I became intrigued with their batik tools, and they work with wax. I work with wax, so I wanted to see how I could incorporate them into my work. So that's part of how these are done. One thing I really like about this process is that I can layer colors, but I don't actually know what's going to show until the pattern starts to emerge, and then I get to decide what I want to highlight and what I want to push back in space. One thing I want is for the viewer to really be aware of the overwhelming sense of pattern as well as the sense of color that's in the work as well. Now this piece together represented a slight departure for me, so I still have the same type of pattern work, but I really wanted to play with going deeper into the pattern work in the piece itself. So in this particular piece, I created and designed stencils that I laid underneath the wax, and that's what all of this yellow-orange area is. And then I painted over top of all the stencils, so this was all green at one point, and started laying patterning in, and then when I was done, I pulled up the stencil to reveal the orange part underneath. And similarly, I like getting surprised, so I really like the fact that I can't predict how the work is going to look until I hit a certain stage of it. Now with that said, I've been doing this a long time, so I can make some educated guesses, but I always get surprised. That's one constant. And I really liked this idea of the patterns having a conversation with each other, and one that was contrasting. So there are some similarities to the patterns. This one is circular, and this one is kind of circular, but it's angled out at the edges. They take up about the same amount of space, but they're in radically different colors. So I really wanted to see what type of conversations patterns could have when they were used this way. Now this is a more recent piece, and this one is during the pandemic. This one is called Bound. And one thing I became aware of the first summer after the pandemic is that was when Black Lives Matter protests were going on, and we didn't have vaccines, and my patterns and how they interacted in space started to change. So I started by having a line somewhere where there were 2 different types of space, and I started using the same pattern, but the pattern would change as it crossed into new territory. And so for me, this really symbolized the different realities people were living in and the conflicting opinions about different socioeconomic, political, and cultural things. Within my own family, I had family members who lived in a very different reality than myself. So in some ways, this helped me process how that was happening in our country through form and space. And so all of these started to become a dialogue about this. This particular piece I did almost a year later. So this one was done in March or April 2021. And by this time I had started not just having one line that differentiated space, but 2. And I wanted to show how complex things were becoming. So in this particular instance, the pattern moves across the surface contiguously. So it doesn't turn, it doesn't go backwards. It's the same all the way across, but what changes is what's underneath it, which really symbolized different movements in individual people and their perceptions. If you're able to see this work in person, I hope you'll take some time and really explore how the colors show in different parts of the piece as well, because that's something that I really play with a lot physically when I'm in the studio. So this is one of my more recent pieces. This one was done in September of 2021. I was at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts in just outside of Lynchburg, Virginia, an artist colony for a 3-week residency. And this is the first piece I made there, and this was really typical of the work I was making at this time. And it plays off of Bound, which you just saw, but one thing that I did was I wanted to have one line in space that was different, where you could see this tangible shift in color and tonality from here to here. What also happens in this piece is that there's another line right here that's not as noticeable. So you can see the ground color is the same here and here, but what really starts to change are the colors underneath the surface. So I wanted it to symbolize much the same thing as Bound, but in a more subtle and elusive way, so people could discover things as they started to look at the piece, rather than having all the answers laid out before them. I can say I never thought I would be an abstract artist because I was figurative for so long, but my work always had patterning as a central part of it. And one thing I've discovered now that I do pattern-based abstraction is that I really love the way patterns can stand in, and abstract shapes and colors can stand in for events and emotions and perceptions. So I have a feeling I'm going to continue discovering this through the rest of my career.